Hello, Pastor Matthew Deal here with Evan, Round Top Church Christian Fellowship, and glad you could join us. Have a little word here about today's sermon, the power of God in you. And believe it or not, God's designed all of us to have His power work in us, spiritual power that is. And it's so unique to the fallen world, but the reality is God has designed us, and we can receive God's power. And when I say power, I don't mean I can all these physical powers. It's not what I'm talking about, but the power of God's grace, His love, His joy, His peace, His kindness, His gentleness, His self-control at work in you. This is a game changer because these apply to any situation you're involved in life. And so today we talked about that as Paul wrote a letter to his friends in Ephesus. We were in Ephesus chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. And anyway, Evan, I picked up on, you picked up on some things I said. And what do you got? You have my notes in front of you. And
you said here in the sermon, the God power in you, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Could you?
Well, I quoted, and I got, where did I say I got that from?
Franklin D. Roosevelt in his inaugurational address.
1933.
33.
That's a while back, huh?
Yeah.
Almost 100, 90 plus years ago. Okay, let's look at the setting. It's always context, right? And so FDR was a president that was elected to fix things because the economy, especially for the lower economic classes, just wasn't working. The industrialists had, if you will, run away with the economy in the 1920s. Well, way before that, but it hit the fan, and by 1929 the big stock market crash. And so FDR came to power, to president, to help things, fix things. And he's talking to a country that's nothing like today. You can imagine the bread lines and people without. I mean, you can read about the Great Depression. This was the beginning years of the Great Depression. And it was, in today's modern terms, to look back at the country was as it was then. I mean, it's horrific, and so he stands up in his address in fear. He knows that fear grips people's lives. Where's my next meal going to come from? I don't have a job. How can I provide for my family? It was tough times. And so he gets up and what's he going to say? And most historians look at FDR. He was kind of quiet about his specifics on how he was going to really change the economy around. So he gets up there, and in his speech, it's really a calming effect. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. So if you think about that, it's like, what are you afraid of? And how are you going to let fear control your life? And if fear controls your life, you're not going to come out of the hole you're in. Okay. So let's back up there to the Bible. We know from 1 John that God is love. 1 John chapter 4. And I believe I quoted verse 18 there also. Later on it says, there's no fear in the love of God. And so if we have a relationship with God, and God's Spirit is operating inside us, no matter what happens to us, we're not going to be afraid. So that's pretty challenging because as a believer, we can have a lot of things happen to us that we're afraid. Now, I understand. So it's a supernatural, it's a God thing. Let's look at people who've really been challenged. And I've brought her name up before, Corrie ten Boom, in the Holocaust of World War II. You can find her books, or books about her, The Hiding Place. And she says, and I've quoted this before because it's often quoted by ministers, there's no pit deep enough that my Christ is not deeper. Now, that's coming from a person who lost her family to the Nazis in the Holocaust, in the camps, and she miraculously survives the camps, and a whole unique story about how she got out. But can you imagine a person like that saying, Christ is deeper than any pit the Nazis can put me in? She developed, I'm not afraid. See, she didn't let fear grip and rule her life. Because get this, she gets out and becomes a spokesperson for God about how to handle things in difficult times. So I encourage everybody to look her up. Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place, and there's lots of books she wrote about that. But fear, just think about the church overall. In my view, biblical Christianity has really very rarely been seen on this planet. With Christ, yes, you have movements in history, but once government got involved with the church, particularly in the 4th century under Constantine, they ruled with a lot of fear. I mean, they really did. I mean, they put edicts out that if you were caught with alternative writings other than their church hierarchy that they put in place, you could be arrested, imprisoned, or put to death. So that's a lot of fear they ruled by. I don't see Christ coming with a gospel message, you're to fear. You know, I mean, there's a reverence fear for what sin does to us, yes. Well, let me back up. There's a reverence fear for God and an honor. I understand that, okay? But we should fear what sin does to us. But God says that I'm love, He's love, and there is no fear in the love of God. So the purest sense of what God's called us to is to handle our fear. I mean, part of the Christian life is that's a goal. And, you know, no matter what happens, and I know people today, they see the government and they see this and that, and they're afraid. Well, you know, that's why I did those 3 sermons, God's in Control. You know, God lets mankind run his own affairs to a large degree. And those of us who have allowed God's Spirit to come into our heart, all these things that are happening right now, we're not afraid of. We're not afraid of. Because we know God is the author of life, and we know where we're going to be, and we're here to witness His love in the midst of this chaos. You know, the New Testament was written in the middle of one of the most oppressive political governments in world history, the Romans. Really? They crucified people thousands at a time on the road for everybody to see. Not the only ones to be brutal, but this is one of the more brutal governments in history. And what does God do? You know, I made a joke, well, not really a joke, depends on how you look at it. If I was God, which I'm just being funny here, okay? If I was God, I'm going to incarnate myself as a human being. I'm going to make it be a white guy in the middle of a cornfield in Kansas in about 1950. I got all the civil rights protections. I'm a protected class. Nothing's going to happen to me. I can do pretty much say what I want to say. Oh yeah, and I go to, you know, the best schools in the world, you know.
Yeah.
But that's not what God did he? He incarnated Himself into one of the most oppressive governments in world history, in the backwater of their province, of their world. And what happened? In 300 years, the same Roman government that oppressed Christ with the Jews, well, the leading Jews, came to God, Constantine as the example, and reached out to save his own empire, to Christianity. Now, he didn't manage it right, but the point being, he saw a greater power than his government, and he reached out to. So he was more afraid of everything else in the world than he was of the gospel. He thought that was a greater power. He felt more secure there. Again, we can read history, didn't necessarily manage it the best way, but most of us don't manage things very well anyway. So fear. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, great words at his time to a country who was hurting, and they needed to hear words like that for not only healing, spiritual healing, but for a future. That I have a future, and I can just keep intact my personal feelings. I don't let this fear thing control my life. So, does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, hey, glad you could listen in. I know there's a lot of young people out there seeing a lot of things going on right now in the world, and there's fear. But you know, when God's Spirit is in you operating, and you know you soul out 100%. All the things that are going on in the world right now are secondary. You're at peace with God, and therefore you can be at peace with your neighbor. When Jesus Christ can look to the people that crucified Him, and from the cross said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." See, that's not coming from fear. That's coming from total peace in total harmony with God, which is who he was and who he is. And so, like this message, hit the bell on your screen there, and that way the new one will come up when they come up, and you'll get noticed. And then send me an email if you have a question to the address on the screen. And we thank you for joining us today. God bless each and every one of you. Amen.